Hello everyone, my name is Tamiwa Aladikamom and this is The Next Way by TechCabal. On the last episode, we spoke about smart cities in Africa and the possibilities and challenges of applying innovation to solve problems in Africa's urban areas. For this episode, we're talking about super apps. Super apps are mobile phone applications that offer access to a variety of options, from e-commerce to payments, ride-hailing, instant messaging, food delivery, and more, all in a single app. By consolidating multiple services into a single point of entry, these apps aim to solve multiple problems for consumers and rapidly build loyalty and position for the lucky apps that succeed at delivering on their promise. It's a tricky act. Today, we'll be speaking about Africa's super apps, from now established players like Opay and Kenya's M-Pesa, which is now evolving from a payment platform to include features like event and bus ticketing, gift vouchers, and more, to growing players like Uganda's Safeboda. With me today, I have Emeka Ajene, who's the co-founder of Gozem, a super app that provides on-demand transportation, delivery, and cashless payment solutions in one app to hundreds and thousands of users across Francophone West Africa and Central Africa. I also have Alastair Sussock, the co-founder and co-CEO of Safeboda, a company revolutionizing transportation, payments, and on-demand services in Africa's cities. Welcome. It's great to have you on the show, Emeka.
Thank you, Tamiwa. Great to be here.
Excellent. There's a portion of Africa's startup land that is super enthusiastic about super apps. While a lot of this activity has been inspired by the success of Asian super apps like WeChat, Alipay, Gojek, and Grab, there are also a number of factors that make Africa fertile ground for super apps. In your opinion, what are the factors that made Gozem jump into the super app space and have made it so attractive to players from Opay to Safeboda?
Yeah, no, so I think you're absolutely right. I think increasingly super apps are just on trend. More and more players are exploring the super app model, right? So you talk about Gozem, and for us, from day one, that was always the model, right? We were very inspired by the success of Grab and Gojek in Southeast Asia. And we thought, to your point, certain characteristics of the market in Africa were very conducive to having similar success on the continent. All right. So in terms of those characteristics specifically, I think of them in terms of pulls and pushes. Right. So when I say pulls, it's kind of how's the market pulling a super app as a solution. Right. So what that means is why super apps might be attractive to African consumers. Right. So there's a few reasons here. One is really the average African smartphone user is using a low-end smartphone. I think recent data has shown that 85% of new shipments of smartphones were under $200, right? And a good chunk of that is under $100, right? So you have a lot of these low-end phones with low specs, and particularly for our purposes here, low storage, right? So in this context, a super app is extremely valuable. Right, instead of, you don't even have storage for, to have a number of apps, but you could have the utility of thousands of apps with the storage cost of just one, right? So that's kind of one of the things that the market pulls a super app solution out. A second is kind of the high cost of data, right? So if you look at stats that have come out in the past few years, they say on average, the cost of 1 gigabyte of data is about 7% of the monthly salary in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, compared to about 2% in the Americas, right? So in this kind of environment, it may be preferable to download and use just one app as opposed to downloading and using multiple apps, right? So there's that data factor as well. And probably thirdly, relative to the consumer pull, is kind of overall, the internet economy is young, right? So, you guys, TechCabal, you cover the space. But it's really, over the last decade or since 2010, so it's relatively young compared to the global tech space. And what this means is, we see it that Africa as a continent has the world's lowest internet penetration rate, and a lot of people are coming on for the first time. So for super app, what it means is having the opportunity for a new internet user to learn a single interface and get comfortable with it, have unified identity, unified payments. It just takes away a lot of friction, right? As opposed to having to learn new interfaces constantly from different apps, right? So those are some of the what we see in terms of the market dynamics making super apps conducive to users. And on the company side, a lot of companies aren't necessarily like Gozem, who start up day one saying we're trying to build a super app. Some companies start up in different verticals and then explore super apps. And why is that, right? So ultimately, the continent right now is really a mobile first, and in many ways, a mobile only environment, right? So it's very natural to explore innovative mobile first and mobile only models, right? And super apps are a prime example of that. Secondly, it's kind of a low trust environment, right? So there's a real opportunity for anyone who builds trust, any business that builds trust, to develop, to leverage that trust across other verticals, and that's what we see a number of new players doing. Thirdly, you have it's kind of again a very new environment compared to the world, right? So not a lot of entrenched players, right? As opposed to the U.S. and other developed markets. If you want to do fintech, you'll run some big players. You want to do e-commerce, you'll run two big players. Across the continent, that's not necessarily the case, right? So that also makes it attractive for businesses. And finally, there's simple economic incentives, right? So overall, the continent is kind of a low average revenue per user continent. So a lot of businesses see that and look at super apps as a way to really spread that cost of customer acquisition, increase lifetime value, and also attack the fragmentation that the continent faces, right? If it's very hard for me to scale across the continent due to fragmentation, can I now scale across verticals instead of scaling across regions, right? So those are some of the reasons I feel more and more folks are looking at the super app model.
Thanks, Emeka. That was a great introduction into this space. Now, we've seen companies evolve from providing a specific core service into super apps. So Safeboda in Uganda, Temtem in Algeria, and Gokada in Nigeria were all ride-hailing companies. M-Pesa in Kenya and MNT Halan in Egypt were primarily focused on payments and financing, while MTN obviously was in the telco industry. What would you say the playbook looks like for succeeding as a super app from the trajectory of those different companies, especially as each one started from a very different sort of field and starting point?
Yeah, no, so I think overall the playbook is really doesn't matter in terms of the vertical you start from, to just be kind of, to speak very broadly, right? So the playbook overall is to start with a single service. Even Gozem, even though, as Gozem, we were from day one, as you mentioned, we had the idea to build a super app. We didn't start off day one with, 5 verticals, right? So everyone tends to start with one vertical, and the reason for that is what you're trying to do is really have a killer first service that attracts a large user base, that also keeps that user base coming back frequently, right? So those are kind of some of the keys, right? So, whether that's messaging in WeChat's case, whether that's ride-hailing, Gozem, Safeboda, and some players, what you want is to have a service that's attractive, high quality, attracts users, and keeps those users coming back. So what you hear in terms of the lingo is the idea of frequency, right? So high frequency vertical. So that just means you want users coming back several times weekly, or ideally several times daily. And that just gives you a lot of opportunity to cross-sell different verticals, right? So that's kind of the first prong to identify and create really a high frequency vertical. And then after that, and that vertical tends to be low margin, right? So you think about ride-hailing, Uber is a good example, just low margin. You also think about messaging, right? Tends to be low margin. And then you can now use that high-frequency, low-margin business, cross-sell and layer on higher margin, lower frequency items, whether that's e-commerce, food delivery. These are some very high-margin businesses, but you don't necessarily order food every day. But you might, take a transport trip every day. You might message your friends every day, right? So that's kind of the broad playbook. I think, if you look across Africa, what I see is kind of a different, maybe WeChat's an example, again, to go back. WeChat is a messaging first super app, right? Across Africa, you don't see many messaging first super apps. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because WhatsApp is so dominant. Right? So everyone uses WhatsApp. It's very hard for you to come in as a new messaging player and say, people should use my, my new messaging service, right? So what you end up seeing is a lot of mobility first players, Gozem, Gokada, Safeboda, and so forth. And you also see a number of financial services first super apps, the OPay type company, PoundPay, and a few others, JumiaPay you could also say, and then a few telco first super apps, as you mentioned, right? So Vodacom, M-Pesa, and a few others are building these super apps. So that's kind of the landscape you see. But it's interesting. There's, There's a few players attacking that first vertical in different ways. There's kind of that data-free model, where data is a big concern. I forget why the name of the company is skipping me right now, but out of South Africa, there's a big data-free super app player there. And there's a few other players trying to get at it from a gaming-first standpoint. So can I build that frequency with gaming first and then layer on other services? So that's kind of the landscape I see, but the playbook overall, high frequency service, that's low margin, layer on higher margin businesses afterwards.
Thanks, Emeka. So what are the challenges to making a super app work in Africa? What kind of things hinder growth or make success difficult?
No, so it's a good question. I think, as you know, it's the space overall. I mean, I'll just be clear, it's still day one in terms of Africa's internet economy, right? So despite all the successes, we talk about unicorns, we talk about the growth, but it's still the earliest days, right? So while more and more people have smartphones on the ground, the reality is that having a smartphone does not make you a regular internet user, right? I'm sure you know, some friends of mine as well, you have a smartphone, but there's still points in the day that people go into their smartphone and turn the data off. Right, so there's this kind of idea of internet affordability. You know, as mentioned before, it's very expensive to be on the internet in Africa. So that just creates a challenge for a business that is online first or online only, like a super app, right? Beyond that, there's also, broad issues of disposable income, right? So it's the idea of you'll have a lot of people saying that what you want to do if you're building a business in Africa today is really build for kind of the core needs of users, food, transport, and so forth, right? So as you grow out a super app, you might go further and further away from core need like transport, right? So these are some of the challenges as you grow. And in addition to that, there's also kind of, the broader infrastructure, right? So not everywhere has even internet coverage for you to do a super app, right? If I live in a rural area of Togo, do I even have the same access to a super app that someone else might? So these are kind of some of the challenges. And overall, I would say also that most super apps tend to be B2C plays, right? So consumer-facing plays. And I would say all B2C plays, or the majority of them today, are kind of playing kind of a long-term game, right? So there's a real obstacle to 100% today, 100% app-based super app, or just focusing purely on digital growth, at least if you're targeting the African consumer. There's a lot of examples of that, I think, and I wouldn't go into them, but there's a lot of examples of that. So I think all these B2C players have to look beyond the app, at least right now, to generate revenue. And for us, for Gozem and a few players, a good example is kind of looking to vehicle financing, right? So while Gozem has, transport, while we have e-commerce, while we have, food delivery, a big, an increasingly important part of the business is actually offline financing of vehicles to drivers, right? So as we are ready to ride the wave of consumers, coming online and being more digitally savvy, we also recognize that today it's important to also have some exposure to an offline, really B2B service like vehicle financing for our drivers. So it's just something I think that a lot of players, B2B, whether you're a super app or not, that you have to really consider that it's still day one in Africa. So how are you going to gather that scale in terms of GMV revenue or what have you?
Gotcha. Thank you. So the Asian super apps got into the space well ahead of Africa. What is your sense of what African super apps can learn from their Asian counterparts, particularly when it comes to hacking growth and expansion?
Yes, so it's a very interesting question, right? So I've said in the past myself, right, that African entrepreneurs, African startups should look to Asia as a model instead of the U.S., right? The market's just more comparable to African markets than Western markets, right? But that being said, it's while it's important to look to these markets above all for business model inspiration and to get a sense of how you can succeed where internet's not perfect, where you have other characteristics. The market isn't completely analogous, right? So, for example, we talk about WeChat a lot in this discussion about super apps, but it really doesn't make sense to WeChat, obviously a Chinese company, but really doesn't make sense to compare, for example, China to Africa, right? So China is one homogeneous market, one large homogeneous market. Africa, you have a lot of regulatory fragmentation. So much, it's exponentially difficult to penetrate the African continent than to penetrate China, right? So there's real, you have to be sensitive on, your learnings and takeaways from looking at Asia. But kind of again, if you look at the Gozem example, we're really inspired from Grab and Gojek, Indonesia, Singapore as well. While these markets are different, there's certain things you could take diving more deeply into the story, right? I think your question is a bit more about expansion and hacking growth. So I mean, what you learn is how do you satisfy users? How do you satisfy drivers? What incentives come to play relative to growth? On the expansion side is just learning from these companies in terms of their sequence of expansion, right? And trying to take away insights that might not be readily apparent, right? So for example, I mean, WeChat, again, we started with messaging in 2011. They went to social payments and games, right, in 2013. And then after that, they had the partnership with Didi in 2014 and started commerce the same year. And then finally, 2017 was the launch of mini apps, right? So this is, and WeChat itself launched in 2010, right? So you have a 7-year span from launch until the ultimate mini apps that everyone considered the holy grail of a super app today. But even beyond that, you have from 2010 until 2013. So 3 years of just one vertical, really just messaging, before they layer on payments, before they layer on ride hailing, right? So it's, so there's different things you could take away, but one of the takeaways for us is that it's really right to get that first service right? And it's not just, it doesn't make sense just to rush it in the name of having a super app. What you really want, again, is that, core user base, having that high frequency before layering on other things. So that's kind of what I would say is, looking at some of, going beyond the headlines, looking at some of the stories and the operational, how these companies actually operated in the early days and trying to take away insights from that.
Emeka, thank you so very much. This has been a really great introduction into super apps. We're going to go on a quick commercial break now, and when we come back, we're going to have Alastair talking a bit more about how super apps are changing Africa's economic landscape. So stay tuned. All right, welcome back, everyone. With us, we have Alastair Sussock, who is the co-founder of Safeboda. Hi, Alastair, how are you?
Hey, guys. Yeah, good to be here.
Fantastic. So a frequent origin for super apps is that they evolve from a single focused product into something more expansive over time. Can you tell us a bit about Safeboda's evolution as a product?
Yeah, no, I mean, from small beginnings in the end of 2014, right? So a while back now, Safeboda started as a community of motorcycle taxi drivers, right? And in Uganda, they're known as Boda Boda. And basically, it was myself, Ricky, and Max. And Ricky, we were the co-founders, and Ricky was a Boda driver. And we had this vision of kind of building a community of drivers that were seen to be safer, more trusted. They would have these big orange helmets with a reflector jacket with their personal name on the back, right? So in Kampala, every day, there's 1.5 million rides. There's Boda Boda everywhere on every street corner. People use them, but they're incredibly unsafe and not trusted. So this community of drivers that we're building would be very different to that. So that's where it all started. It wasn't a tech play. It was very much a community play. It was like working with these drivers, doing training, and showing that they were different, right? Then we, of course, realized that there was a way to build, an app system. This was 2014, so Uber was growing around the world. There was understanding that there was this kind of ride-hailing was emerging, and so we built a basic version of that with a cashless payment in it, right? So the cashless payment was a way to kind of seamlessly go from A to B and not worry about change, right? That was a small percentage of our overall rides. It wasn't half of our rides; it was less, but it was something that was quite innovative and enabled us to be able to offer something of value in the market as well. So yes, we built the trust, we think, with customers. And then, of course, we kind of realized maybe there's a bunch of other stuff that we can provide our drivers and our customers, right? What else can we provide on our app, which, of course, became a platform, what else can you provide on that platform? And so then over time, we kind of looked at other things that were possible that we could build, right? So kind of parcel delivery, food delivery, and then kind of payments, right? So we had this wallet from day one, closed loop wallet. What else could we provide? What bill payment use cases could we do? Could people send Safeboda cashless to each other? So we looked at all of that stuff, and we built many of those things. And then, recently now we've got cars as well on the app as another transportation key use case. So definitely evolving from the single use case to multiple use cases. We've completed over 45 million rides as a business, and a reasonable monthly active user base. And the core transport use case, though, is still the important one. So there's lots of interesting learnings about, the challenges as well of building a super app, which can claim to do many things.
I love the origin and community. I also love a reasonable user base. It's an interesting way to phrase it. What are the trends that you're most optimistic about? What are the things that you've seen in market that make you feel like, look, there is a long-term sort of future in this, like there is a big business still to be built in this space?
Yeah, I think it's maybe it's the cliche answers around users. The number of people getting smartphones, the number of people getting online, penetration of services is still very low, which means there's lots of potential for it to grow. Data costs are coming down, for people to get online. That is happening. Whether it's happening fast enough to satisfy many company entrepreneurs right now, day to day, they feel the constraints of that. I think, that's a challenge, but definitely we are moving in that big macro trend of people getting online is happening. The rural to urban, migration that's happening across so many countries, that's something which is only going to benefit particularly, tech companies. I think another big trend, though, is that companies with large, solid core businesses will do very well in the next few years, right? So telecoms, that have large amount of users that are using the rails of the SIM card or of mobile money, they're going to be in a good position, right? So if you look at Safaricom and M-Pesa, they're just expanding their reach, their depth. And so, and I think, the cost of capital has gone up. And so acquisition of customers is going to be very hard in the next year or two. Or it's just not going to be easy to grow very fast, right? So we definitely saw in 2018, 2019, a wave of companies, really acquiring lots of users. I mean, OPay would be an example in Nigeria, kind of big bang, super app approach, build a bunch of stuff, and then quickly cut the stuff that wasn't working or they felt wasn't working. So I think as a trend, we're not going to see as much of that kind of a very aggressive expansion. It's going to be more the well-established players that have already existing customer bases that they're monetizing. And then on the B2B side, I mean, that's going to be a bit easier because, those acquisition costs are not going to be as high. And the question is like the depth that they're going as well. I think payment companies we're seeing across, payment companies, super apps, are promising. It's just the question is how well they can, how well they can keep going now with the cost of capital being higher.
Fantastic. No, that's useful perspective. Thank you for sharing. Are there big regulatory concerns you have, especially operating across markets?
Generally, there's not any huge concerns. We're obviously in a very informal sector, with two-wheelers, with motorcycle taxis, Okada, Boda. Cars is more regulated. We follow, the regulation in wherever they exist in both markets, right? In Uganda, passengers are by law supposed to wear helmets, right? Our drivers carry a spare helmet, but most drivers don't wear helmets, and you'll see police officers driving with no helmet on, right? So some of these markets, there's regulation, but whether regulation is enforced is kind of the question. So, we want to work with government as best as we can and to help regulate, make the industry safer. We know we're well positioned to do that because we are, trying to help our drivers follow all the rules and, help them show, to customers, importantly, that they are, they're trusted and safe and they have all the protections they need, right? I think we've been a good kind of, like, let's say, showing the economic returns to being safe and to following regulation, right? So drivers that wear helmets make more money because they're Safeboda, right? And so drivers are then incentivized to ultimately follow the rules. So it's kind of been a way to like silently regulate the industry without using, kind of, if you have a carrot and stick method, using a carrot method, which is, hey, wear a helmet, wear a reflective jacket, have a helmet for your passenger, reduce, road accidents, which is a huge killer and a huge GDP, negative effect on every market we're in. It really hurts the economy. Do all this and then you get there. Yeah.
That was really, really fascinating, useful to hear. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Alastair. I'm going to have to bring today's conversation to a close, but thank you for joining us, and we appreciate your perspectives. For the audience, I hope today's conversation has been a useful introduction to super apps and the issues around them across the continent. Thank you for joining us. I'd also like to thank everyone who's been watching. Join us next week when we talk about building the African metaverse. As always, you can tweet at us using the hashtag #TheNextWaveCNBC. You can also send in your feedback via thenextwave@techcabal.com. Thanks again, and see you soon.